The sound was not of wood breaking, but rather resembling the agonizing scream of a living creature being crushed. It was a high-pitched, resonant shriek that tore through the freezing silence of the Weddell Sea, echoing off the endless plains of white that stretched toward every horizon. Deep within the belly of the ship, the massive beams of Norwegian fir and oak, chosen specifically for their ability to withstand the wrath of the gods, were buckling. They groaned under a pressure that was calculated in millions of tons, a pressure applied by the slow, inexorable shifting of the ice flows. Outside, the temperature hovered at a numbing 30 degrees below zero, a cold so profound that it seemed to possess a physical weight, pressing against the lungs with every inhalation. The date was October 27, 1915, and on this day, the finest ship ever built for the polar ice, the Endurance, was dying. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy and the miracle that would eventually follow, one must step back from the terrifying sound of snapping timber and retreat into the quiet, dusty rooms of London where the dream was first conceived. It was the tail end of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, a period defined by men of iron wills and wool coats hurling themselves against the most inhospitable corners of the map. By 1914, the primary prize had already been claimed. Roald Amundsen, the methodical Norwegian, had planted his flag at the South Pole in December of 1911. Robert Falcon Scott, the brooding Englishman, had arrived a month later, only to find he was second, and had subsequently perished with his men on the return journey, frozen in a tent just 11 miles from safety. The race was over. The world felt that the Antarctic had been conquered, its mysteries unveiled, its lethal challenges met. But for Sir Ernest Shackleton, a man whose ambition burned with a restless, almost feverish intensity, the conquest was incomplete. There remained one great prize, one final, desperate challenge that would justify the existence of an explorer in a world that was rapidly running out of blank spaces. It was the crossing. The goal was not merely to touch the pole and return, but to traverse the entire Antarctic continent from sea to sea, a journey of 1,800 miles across the frozen heart of the world. It was an audacity that bordered on madness. It required a ship that could withstand the crushing grip of the pack ice, a crew that could endure months of total darkness, and a leader who could hold the fabric of sanity together when the world turned entirely white. The preparation for such a monumental undertaking was in itself a story of meticulous obsession. Shackleton, a charismatic figure with a heavy jaw and eyes that seemed to constantly search the horizon, began the grueling process of fundraising and recruitment. He operated out of a small office in London, surrounded by maps and tobacco smoke, charming wealthy donors and battling skeptical government officials. The legend of his recruitment notice, often cited in later years, spoke of men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. While the actual advertisement may have been less dramatic, the sentiment was entirely accurate. 5,000 men applied. They were drawn by the allure of the unknown, by the romanticism of the ice, or perhaps simply by the desire to escape the mundane grayness of industrialized England. From these thousands, Shackleton selected 27. They were a motley collection of personalities, a cross-section of British society condensed into a microcosm of survival. There was Frank Wild, Shackleton's loyal second-in-command, a man of small stature but immense durability, who had been to the ice so many times he seemed more at home in a blizzard than in a garden. There was Frank Worsley, the captain of the ship,
an eccentric New Zealander who claimed to have been guided by dreams and who possessed an uncanny ability to navigate the ship through shifting chaos. There was Tom Crean, the towering Irishman, a giant of a man with a chest like a barrel and a heart to match, whose physical strength was legendary among polar explorers. And there were the others, the doctors, the scientists, the carpenter, the cook, and the stowaway, who would eventually be accepted into the fold. They were not soldiers, though they possessed a discipline of their own. They were sailors, trawlermen, and academics, bound together by a contract that promised them little more than hardship. The vessel that would carry them to the bottom of the world was originally named the Polaris, but Shackleton, with his flair for the dramatic and his deep belief in his family motto, Fortitudine vincemus, by endurance we conquer, rechristened her the Endurance. She was built in the Framnes shipyard in Sandefjord, Norway, by master shipbuilders who understood the violence of the ice. She was a three-masted barkentine, 144 feet long, powered by both sail and a coal-fired steam engine. But her true beauty lay in her construction. She was designed not for speed, but for survival. Her hull was a fortress. The planking was made of oak and Norwegian fir, ranging up to 30 inches in thickness. The bow, which would be tasked with smashing through sheets of pack ice, was reinforced with a massive web of cross-bracing and sheathed in greenheart, a wood so dense it sinks in water, and then shod in steel. The design was specific and intentional. Unlike modern steel icebreakers that slice through the ice, the Endurance was designed with a rounded hull. The theory was that when the ice pack closed in and the immense lateral pressure began to build, the ship would not be crushed, but would instead rise upward, popping out of the ice like a watermelon seed squeezed between fingers. She was painted black, a stark contrast to the blinding white world she was destined for, and she was provisioned with enough food and fuel to sustain 28 men and 69 sled dogs for 2 years. The hold was packed with crates of pemmican, a dense mixture of dried meat and fat that served as the staple of polar diets, along with dried vegetables, tinned meats, flour, sugar, and tobacco. There were sleeping bags made of reindeer fur, wind-proof gabardine clothing, scientific instruments, and a dark room for the photographer, Frank Hurley. The departure of the Endurance from Plymouth on August 8, 1914, occurred under the ominous shadow of a different kind of storm. The First World War had erupted just days prior. The air in inland was thick with patriotic fervor and the anxiety of impending conflict. Shackleton, torn between his duty to his country and his commitment to the expedition, offered his ship and crew to the British Admiralty for the war effort. It was an immense sacrifice, risking the cancellation of a dream that had taken years to build. But the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, sent a one-word telegram in reply: "Proceed." And so, while Europe prepared to descend into the muddy hell of the trenches, the Endurance turned her bow south, sailing away from the fire of war and toward the ice. The journey south through the Atlantic was a long, slow transition from the familiar to the alien. They stopped in Buenos Aires, where the final crew changes were made, and where the disciplined veneer of the expedition was first tested by the rowdy nightlife of the port and the erratic behavior of the original cook, who was promptly fired and replaced. It was here that they took on board the dogs. They were not the sleek, uniform huskies of modern imagination, but a rugged mix of wolves and working dogs sourced from Canada. They were big, aggressive, and brimming with energy, living in kennels constructed on the deck of the ship. Their howling would become the soundtrack of the voyage, a primal chorus that reminded the men they were traveling with beasts.
Leaving South America, the Endurance pushed into the South Atlantic, aiming for the island of South Georgia. This remote, rugged outpost was the last station of civilization, a bleak collection of whaling stations where Norwegian whalers processed the giants of the deep. The smell of South Georgia was distinct, a cloying mixture of burning coal and boiling whale blubber that hung in the damp air. Here the whalers, men who knew the southern oceans better than anyone, looked at Shackleton's plan with deep concern. They reported that the ice conditions in the Weddell Sea were the worst in living memory. The pack ice, usually retreating in the Antarctic summer, had remained stubbornly far north. The sea was clogged, a labyrinth of shifting white walls waiting to snare any ship foolish enough to enter. Shackleton listened to their warnings, his face grim but his resolve unshaken. He waited for a month, hoping the conditions would improve, pacing the docks of Grytviken, watching the gray waves roll in. But the season was advancing. To wait longer would mean missing the window for the crossing entirely. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance cast off from South Georgia. The whalers watched her go, shaking their heads, convinced they would never see the black ship again. As the mountains of the island faded into the mist behind them, the 28 men aboard entered a world of isolation so complete that it is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. There were no radios to call for help, no satellites to track their position, no rescue planes to drop supplies. They were effectively leaving the planet, stepping off the edge of the known world into a void of wind and water. The first encounter with the ice came sooner than expected. Within days, they spotted the first icebergs, majestic cathedrals of blue and white, drifting silently in the dark water. Then came the pack, loose at first, streams of slush and small floes that bumped gently against the hull. But as they pushed further south, the ice thickened. It became a chaotic puzzle of leads, narrow channels of open water that opened and closed at the whim of the wind and current. Navigation became a relentless grind. Worsley, perched in the crow's nest, high up the mast, would shout directions down to the deck, guiding the ship through the twisting labyrinth. "Starboard! Steady! Hard a port!" The ship would ram through the thinner floes, the noise of the impact shuddering through the timber, then slide into a pool of dark water, only to be blocked again 100 yards later. Days turned to weeks. The progress was agonizingly slow. Sometimes they would make 30 miles in a day. Sometimes they would be forced to tie up to a floe and wait for the wind to change, drifting backward with the current, losing hard-won ground. The Antarctic summer, despite the 24 hours of daylight, provided little warmth. The sun was a pale disk circling the horizon, offering a cold, sterile light that cast long, confusing shadows across the snow. The men worked in shifts, clearing ice from the decks, tending to the dogs, and maintaining the engine, which gobbled coal at an alarming rate. Yet spirits remained high. There was a sense of adventure, a camaraderie forged in the shared purpose. They played football on the larger ice floes when the ship was stuck, the ball skittering across the uneven surface, while the dogs barked excitedly from the rails. They held concerts in the wardroom, singing songs to the accompaniment of a banjo, the tinny notes sounding fragile against the immense silence outside. But the Weddell Sea is a trap. It is a gyre, a circular current that drives ice against the curve of the Antarctic peninsula, compacting it, pressing it together until it forms a solid, impenetrable mass. By mid-January 1915, the Endurance had fought her way to within 80 miles of Vossel Bay, the intended landing point. They were tantalizingly close. The men could almost imagine the sensation of solid ground beneath their boots, the beginning of the great land crossing. But the temperature dropped sharply. The wind shifted. The leads that had been their highways began to freeze over.
the water turning to a thick, glue-like sludge that gripped the hull. The loose pack ice consolidated. On January 18th, the trap snapped shut. A northeasterly gale packed the ice tight against the land, and the Endurance was beset. She was frozen into a floe that stretched for miles in every direction. At first, there was no panic. They had been stuck before and had always broken free. They waited for a gale to open the leads, keeping the steam pressure up, ready to move at a moment's notice. But the gale did not come. The ice thickened. The ship, once a mobile vessel of exploration, had become a fixed station, a wooden island trapped in a white ocean that was slowly drifting north, away from their destination. The realization dawned on them gradually, settling over the crew like the winter darkness that was approaching. They were not going to make landfall. They were going to winter in the pack. The sun began to set. For months they had lived in perpetual daylight, but now the days grew shorter. The psychological impact of the approaching polar night cannot be overstated. It is a darkness that lasts for months, a time when the sun does not rise above the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a twilight that eventually fades into total, crushing blackness. Shackleton, sensing the shift in morale, moved the crew from the forecastle into the warmer, insulated interior of the ship, which they dubbed the Ritz. He established a strict routine to combat the creeping menace of depression and lethargy. There were rigid meal times, assigned duties, and mandatory socialization. He knew that in the polar regions, the mind was as vulnerable as the body. A man who lost hope was a man who would die, and worse, he might take others with him. Winter settled in with a ferocity that defied description. Temperatures plunged to 60 degrees below zero. The wind screamed through the rigging, coating the masts and spars in rime ice that had to be chipped away to prevent the ship from becoming top-heavy and capsizing. The dogs were moved off the ship onto the ice, where dogloos, small igloos made of blocks of ice, were constructed for them. The ice around the ship became a village, a strange extension of the Endurance. They built training tracks for the sled teams, eager to keep the animals and the men fit. Under the light of the moon and the shimmering curtains of the Aurora Australis, the southern lights, they raced the teams, the breath of the dogs pluming in the frigid air like steam engines. But the ice was never still. It was a dynamic, restless skin over the ocean. Even in the depths of winter, unseen currents and tides caused the vast sheets of ice to grind against each other. The noise was constant, a groaning, rumbling, cracking cacophony that sounded like heavy artillery fire or the roar of a distant train. Sometimes a pressure ridge would form near the ship, gigantic blocks of ice weighing tons being thrust 20 feet into the air as two floes collided. The men would watch nervously as these walls of ice advanced toward the ship, praying they would stop before crushing the wooden hull.
For months, the Endurance held her own. Her rounded hull did its job. When the pressure came, she would groan and shudder, rising a few inches, allowing the ice to slip beneath her keel. She was a valiant ship, fighting a battle against forces that dwarfed human engineering. The men grew to love her. She was their only shelter, their warmth, their connection to the world of the living. Inside, the stove burned warm. The smell of tobacco and toasted bread filled the air, and for a few hours they could pretend they were safe. But the ocean is relentless. The spring of 1915 brought not relief, but danger. As the temperatures rose slightly, the pack began to break up and move more violently. The pressure waves became more frequent and more intense. In October, the end began. A massive pressure wave, driven by a storm hundreds of miles away, rippled through the pack. It caught the Endurance in a vice. This time she did not rise. The ice had rafted over itself, climbing the sides of the ship, pinning her down. The noise was deafening. Inside the ship, the beams began to bend. The deck planks buckled, popping nails that shot into the air like bullets. Water began to pour into the hold. The men worked the pumps furiously, stripping to their waists in the freezing bilge, singing songs to keep the rhythm, fighting to save their home. They pumped for 3 days and 3 nights, exhausted, their hands raw and bleeding, their eyes hollow with fatigue. But the ocean was winning. The stern post was torn away, the rudder was crushed, the keel was snapped, the ship was being strangled. Shackleton, who had paced the ice for nights, watching his ship in agony, finally made the decision that broke his heart. On October 27th, at 5 p.m., he gave the order, "She's going, boys. It's time to get off." It was a calm order, delivered with the steady voice of a man who had already accepted the loss and was moving to the next problem. The men abandoned the Endurance. They lowered the 3 lifeboats, the provisions, the sleeping bags, and the dogs onto the ice. They set up a camp on a stable floe a safe distance away, a pathetic collection of tents huddled against the backdrop of the dying ship. That night, they lay in their sleeping bags on the ice, listening to the death throes of the Endurance. The lights on the ship were still burning, powered by the dying generator, casting a surreal glow on the destruction. The crushing sound continued, a relentless grinding that tore the ship apart piece by piece. The mainmast snapped with a report like a cannon shot, crashing onto the deck. The rigging tangled, the funnel crumpled. It was the death of a dream, but also the birth of a new reality. They were no longer explorers seeking a prize. They were castaways fighting for their lives. They were thousands of miles from civilization, with no radio, drifting on a melting piece of ice in the most hostile ocean on Earth. They had no ship. They had only themselves. As the Endurance sank lower, her bow pointed toward the sky in a final salute, the men realized the true weight of their situation. The ocean camp, as they named their temporary home, was a fragile sanctuary. The ice beneath them was only a few feet thick. Below that was 2,000 fathoms of black, freezing water. Killer whales patrolled the leads, their dorsal fins slicing the water, looking for seals or penguins or men. The leopard seals, massive predatory beasts with reptilian heads, lurked on the floes. The cold was a constant physical assault. But as Shackleton looked at his men, huddled around the blubber stove, he knew that the greatest enemy was not the cold or the hunger, but despair. He gathered them together, standing on the ice in the twilight, and spoke to them. He did not offer false hope, but he offered a plan. They would march. They would drag the heavy lifeboats across the rough, hummocked ice toward the open water, and then they would sail to land. It was an impossible task, dragging boats that weighed over a ton through a chaotic landscape of pressure ridges and soft snow, but it was action. It was a purpose. And so the march began. The dump camp was established, shedding every ounce of unnecessary weight. Money, gold watches, clothes, books, everything was left behind. Shackleton took his gold cigarette case and a handful of gold sovereigns and dropped them into the snow, a symbolic gesture to show the men that wealth had no value here. Survival was the only currency. The Bible given to the ship by Queen Alexandra was stripped of its flyleaf and a few pages from the book of Job, and the rest was left on the ice. They harnessed themselves to the boats, straining against the ropes, slipping and falling in the slush, inching their way north. It was grueling, back-breaking labor. After days of exertion, they had covered only a few miles.
The ice was drifting north faster than they could walk. They were on a treadmill, walking endlessly but getting nowhere. Realizing the futility, Shackleton called a halt. They would camp on the ice and let the drift take them. They would wait. This period, known as Patience Camp, would last for months. It was a test of mental endurance, far greater than the physical labor. Their tents became soaked with condensation and melting snow. Their clothes were never dry. Their diet consisted almost entirely of seal meat and penguin, fried in blubber. The flour and biscuits were rationed strictly. When the seals were scarce, hunger gnawed at their bellies. They dreamed of food, elaborate banquets, warm bread, fresh fruit, only to wake up to the smell of burning blubber and the cold canvas of the tent.
The months spent at Patience Camp were a siege of the spirit, a slow-motion battle against the corrosive power of monotony. While the sinking of the Endurance had been a moment of high drama, the drift on the ice was a test of sheer grinding endurance. The floe they inhabited, a vast slab of frozen ocean roughly a mile square, was not merely a platform, it was a vehicle, carrying them steadily northward on the back of the Weddell Gyre. They were passengers on a dissolving raft, moving at the mercy of the winds and currents toward the open ocean where the ice would inevitably break apart. Life settled into a primitive rhythm, governed by the hunt for meat and the preservation of heat. The intricate social structures of the Edwardian era, the class distinctions between the officers in the wardroom and the hands in the forecastle began to erode, replaced by a meritocracy of survival. A man's worth was no longer determined by his accent or his education, but by his ability to butcher a seal without wasting a drop of blood, or his skill in patching a torn boot with improvised thread. Food became the central obsession of their existence. The ship's stores were dwindling rapidly, and the strict rationing meant that hunger was a constant companion. They spoke of food with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. In their diaries, men listed the menus of imaginary banquets they would hold upon their return, detailing courses of heavy puddings, roast beef, and gallons of hot cocoa. In reality, they ate seal steaks, fried in blubber over stoves fueled by seal bones and skin. The smoke from the blubber stoves was thick, oily, and pervasive. It blackened their faces, clung to their hair, and irritated their eyes until they wept constantly. They became a tribe of soot-covered scarecrows, their clothes stiff with grease and blood, their beards matted and wild. Yet even in this filth, Shackleton maintained a rigid discipline. He insisted on order. He knew that if they allowed themselves to behave like savages, they would soon think like savages, and then they would be lost. As the weeks turned into months, the environment began to change. The Antarctic summer returned, bringing with it not warmth, but instability. The solid sheet of pack ice began to soften and rot. Cracks appeared without warning, snaking across the surface of their camp, sometimes running directly beneath a tent. A man might wake in the middle of the night to the sound of the ice tearing apart beneath his sleeping bag, forcing a frantic scramble to move gear to a safer section of the floe. The psychological strain was immense. They were sleeping on a ticking clock. The killer whales, whose blowing sounds could be heard in the leads of open water, seemed to multiply, their dark shapes patrolling the edges of the ice, waiting for the breakup. The situation grew critical in late March 1916. The meat supply was running low. The seals and penguins, which had been plentiful during the winter, had migrated away. The men were starving, their caloric intake far below what was needed to sustain them in the brutal cold. It was then that Shackleton made the second of his heartbreaking decisions.
The dogs, the loyal companions who had pulled the sleds and provided warmth and morale, could no longer be fed. They were consuming meat that the men needed to survive. Worse, they would be a liability in the boats when the ice finally broke. Over the course of several days, the order was given. The teams were taken behind a pressure ridge, one by one. The sound of the gunshots cracked sharply in the cold air, each report a hammer blow to the men who had cared for them. The dogs were not just killed, they were eaten. It was a grim necessity, a crossing of a line that underscored the desperate reality of their predicament. The men ate the dog meat with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, claiming it tasted like beef, perhaps to comfort themselves. By early April, the floe had disintegrated into a small triangle of ice barely large enough to hold the camp. The swell of the ocean could be felt beneath their feet, a rhythmic heaving that signaled they were nearing the edge of the pack. The horizon, once a jagged line of ice, now showed the dark water sky, the reflection of open ocean on the clouds. On April 8th, the end of the drift arrived. The floe cracked directly under the James Caird, the largest of the 3 lifeboats. The men scrambled to save the boat and their supplies as the ice split open, revealing the black water beneath. There was no more waiting. The ice was no longer a refuge, it was a death trap. On April 9, 1916, Shackleton gave the order to launch. The 3 boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, were slid into the water. They were small, open whalers, 22 feet long at most, utterly unsuited for the violence of the Southern Ocean. Into these fragile shells, 28 men packed themselves, along with their sleeping bags, the remaining food, the stoves, and the limited navigation equipment. The transition from the stability of the ice to the chaos of the water was jarring. Immediately, they were at the mercy of the sea. The leads were narrow and choked with brash ice, chunks of debris that acted like grinding stones against the wooden hulls. They had to row frantically to avoid being crushed between colliding floes, the oars clashing against the ice, the men shouting to be heard over the roar of the ocean. The first nights in the boats were a descent into hell. There was no room to lie down. The men sat hunched on the thwarts or curled in the bilge, soaked by freezing spray that froze instantly upon contact with their clothes. They were encased in armor of ice. The temperature dropped and the wind rose. The boats, heavily laden and sitting low in the water, took on seas constantly. They had to bail ceaselessly, a desperate rhythm of scooping water to stay afloat. Sleep was impossible. To close one's eyes was to risk freezing to death or missing a command to fend off a block of ice. Shackleton, in the stern of the James Caird, did not sleep. He stood watch, his eyes scanning the darkness, his presence a singular force of will, keeping the panic at bay. Navigation was a nightmare. Worsley, the captain, attempted to take sightings of the sun with his sextant, a delicate operation requiring a steady hand and a clear horizon, neither of which existed in a heaving lifeboat surrounded by ice. He had to wrap his arms around the mast to steady himself, while 2 men held him upright as the boat pitched and rolled. When he finally calculated their position after a few days of struggle, the news was devastating. The currents of the Weddell Sea were not pushing them north toward safety as they had hoped, but were driving them east, past the tip of the Antarctic peninsula. They were drifting into the open Atlantic, where the nearest land was thousands of miles away. If they missed the tip of the peninsula, there would be nothing between them and Africa but the wildest ocean on the globe. They had to change course. The nearest land was Elephant Island, a desolate, uninhabited rock jutting out of the ocean at the edge of the South Shetland chain. It was a desperate target, a needle in a haystack of storm-tossed water. The men rowed until their hands were raw blisters. They rowed through blizzards that reduced visibility to zero. They rowed while suffering from thirst that was far more agonizing than the hunger. They had run out of fresh water, and the sea ice around them was too salty to melt. Their tongues swelled in their mouths, their lips cracked and bled. Some men began to hallucinate, seeing imaginary fires on the horizon or hearing the voices of loved ones in the shrieking wind. The salt spray covered everything, stinging their eyes, finding every cut and sore on their bodies. These were saltwater boils, painful abscesses caused by the friction of wet, salty clothes against the skin, particularly on the wrists and knees. For 7 days and nights they fought the sea. It was a battle of attrition. The Stancomb Wills, the smallest and least seaworthy of the boats, was constantly lagging behind, half filled with water, her crew bordering on unconsciousness. Shackleton, sensing that the men were reaching their breaking point, ordered the boats to be tied together at night to prevent them from becoming separated in the dark. It was a risky maneuver, as the boats banged against each other in the swell, but losing a boat meant losing part of himself. He would not leave a man behind. On the 7th day, the mist lifted. There, looming out of the gray water, were the black cliffs of Elephant Island. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a forbidding, precipitous rock, battered by surf and wind. But to the men in the boats, it was paradise. It was solid ground. It was a place where the earth would not crack beneath them. But reaching it was not simple. The coastline was a wall of sheer cliffs and glaciers, with huge waves pounding against the rocks. To attempt a landing in the wrong spot would be suicide. They spent an agonizing night offshore, riding out a gale, terrified of being smashed against the cliffs in the darkness. The wind howled down from the glaciers, freezing the clothes to their bodies. It was the worst night of the entire journey, a final test of their resolve. At dawn, the wind eased slightly. Worsley spotted a narrow opening in the reef, a small, rocky beach. With the last reserves of their strength, they rowed through the surf. The boats scraped against the stones. Men jumped into the freezing water, not caring about the cold, desperate to drag the boats ashore. They stumbled onto the pebbled beach, falling to their knees, some laughing hysterically, others weeping, others simply lying face down on the stones, letting the stability of the land seep into their bones. They were the first humans ever to set foot on Elephant Island. They were alive. They were on land. But as the euphoria of the landing faded, the reality of their position set in. Elephant Island was a purgatory. It was a barren rock, miles from any shipping lane. No one would ever come looking for them here. The beach they had landed on was small and exposed to the high tide. They were forced to move to a slightly more sheltered spot, 5 miles down the coast, a spit of land they named Point Wild. It was a grim place, dominated by a massive glacier that constantly calved chunks of ice into the sea with thunderous roars. The smell was overpowering, the stench of centuries of penguin guano that covered the rocks. The wind was relentless, channeling down the glacier like a funnel. They overturned the 2 smaller boats, the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills, and placed them on low stone walls to create a makeshift hut. This cramped, dark, smelly hovel they called the Snuggery would be their home. 22 men crowded under the hulls, sleeping like sardines, while the wind battered the wood above their heads. They had arrived, but they were trapped. The winter was approaching again. They had limited food, no hope of rescue, and the physical condition of the men was deteriorating rapidly. The Blackborough boy, the young stowaway, had severe frostbite on his toes. The ship's carpenter, Chippy McNeish, was rebellious and broken. The others were gaunt, hollow-eyed ghosts. Shackleton looked at his men and knew that staying on Elephant Island was a death sentence. They could survive for a few weeks, perhaps a month or two, on penguins and seals, but eventually the winter would close in, the food would run out, or the sheer misery would kill them. There was only one option left, an option so terrifying, so fraught with danger, that it seemed like a suicide mission in itself. He had to go for help.
The nearest inhabited land was not the South American continent, which was too far and against the prevailing winds. It was South Georgia Island, the whaling outpost from which they had departed nearly a year and a half ago. South Georgia lay 800 miles away across the Scotia Sea. The Scotia Sea is widely considered the most treacherous stretch of ocean on the planet. It is an area of the globe where there is no land mass to break the force of the winds that circle the Earth. The roaring 40s, the furious 50s, and the screaming 60s. These are the names given to the latitudes where the westerly winds blow unchecked, creating waves that are often described as Cape Horn rollers, mountain ranges of water 60 feet high. To cross this ocean in a 22-foot lifeboat was an absurdity. It was a journey that would challenge a modern steel vessel, let alone a modified rowboat. But Shackleton announced the plan. He would take 5 men and the best boat, the James Caird, and attempt to reach South Georgia to organize a rescue. The remaining 22 men would stay behind on Elephant Island under the command of Frank Wild, waiting and praying. The preparation for the voyage of the James Caird began immediately. Harry McNish, the carpenter, despite his earlier insubordination, worked miracles. He took the James Caird and raised her sides by scavenging wood from the other boats and packing cases. He built a makeshift deck out of canvas and sledge runners, sealing it with frozen seal blood and oil paints to make it watertight. He strengthened the keel with the mast of the Stancomb Wills. It was a patchwork job, a desperate attempt to turn an open boat into a semi-enclosed vessel that could survive a hurricane. Shackleton selected his crew with strategic precision. He took Worsley because Worsley was a genius navigator, and without navigation, they were dead. He took Tom Crean, the giant Irishman, for his immense strength and unshakable loyalty. He took McNish, the carpenter, partly for his skills, but largely because Shackleton knew McNish was a troublemaker and didn't want to leave him behind to undermine Wild's authority. He took John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy, 2 strong sailors who had shown resilience in the boats. On Easter Monday, April 24, 1916, the James Caird was launched. The men remaining on Elephant Island gathered on the beach, pathetic figures in their tattered rags, waving goodbye. They gave 3 weak cheers as the boat pulled away. Shackleton stood in the stern, looking back at the diminishing figures of his crew. He knew the odds. He knew that if the Caird sank, the men on the beach would die. They would wait for a rescue that would never come, slowly starving or freezing until the last man fell. The weight of 22 lives rested on the planks of that small boat. As the James Caird cleared the shelter of the land and hit the open ocean, the reality of the challenge became immediate. The boat was struck by the full force of the westerlies. She pitched violently, taking on water. The men, crammed into the tiny space beneath the makeshift deck, were thrown against each other. They had to crawl over the ballast of boulders they had loaded for stability. The noise was deafening, the wind screaming in the rigging, the waves slamming against the hull like sledgehammers. They were 6 men in a wooden chip, afloat on an ocean that wanted to swallow them whole.
The routine on the James Caird was a cycle of misery. They worked in watches of 4 hours on, 4 hours off. On meant steering the boat, which required the strength of 2 men to hold the tiller against the kicking of the rudder, or pumping the bilge or trimming the sails. Off meant crawling into the wet, dark hole beneath the deck, lying on top of the stones and wet sleeping bags, trying to steal a few moments of unconsciousness while the boat lurched like a roller coaster. Everything was wet. The sleeping bags were sodden masses of reindeer hair that weighed 40 pounds and offered no warmth. Their clothes were constantly soaked with freezing water. Their skin broke out in saltwater boils that made every movement an agony. They had to eat cold hoosh, a stew of pemmican and powdered milk, because lighting the Primus stove was a dangerous acrobatic feat in the heaving boat. But the greatest danger was the water itself. The waves of the Southern Ocean are not like normal waves. They are vast rolling hills of water, sometimes a mile from crest to crest. The James Caird would climb the face of a wave, hanging for a moment at the summit, exposed to the full fury of the wind, before plunging down into the trough, a deep valley of water where the sails would flap idly and the horizon would disappear, replaced by walls of gray water towering above them. And amidst all this, Worsley had to navigate. He had to stand up, bracing himself against the mast, shielding the lens of his sextant from the spray, and try to catch a glimpse of the sun or a star. A mistake of 1 degree in his calculation would mean missing the island entirely and being swept out into the endless Atlantic to die of thirst and starvation. Days turned into a blur of gray terror. On the 7th day, a massive gale struck. The wind reached hurricane force. The waves became confused, steep, and breaking. The boat was tossed like a cork. At midnight, Shackleton at the tiller saw a line of white clearing in the sky to the south. He called out to the men that the weather was clearing, but then, a moment later, he realized with a jolt of horror that it was not a clearing sky. It was the white foam of a rogue wave, a monster stretching from horizon to horizon, so high it blotted out the stars. He screamed, "Hold on! For God's sake, hold on! It's got us!" The wave struck the James Caird with a violence that buried the boat under water. For an eternity, there was only darkness and the crushing weight of the ocean. The men held their breath, waiting for the end. Then, miraculously, the boat shuddered and rose, buoyancy fighting against the water, and broke the surface, half filled but still afloat. They pumped like madmen, flinging the water out with pots, sleeping bags, anything they could grab. They survived, but the boat was shaken, and so were the men.
The temperature dropped further. Ice began to form on the boat. It coated the rigging, the deck, and the oars in a thick layer of heavy rime. The boat became top-heavy, wallowing sluggishly in the troughs, threatening to capsize. They had to crawl out onto the slippery pitching deck in the darkness, hacking at the ice with axes and knives, risking being washed overboard with every swing. They threw the spare oars overboard. They threw the sleeping bags that were too frozen to use overboard. They were shedding parts of their survival to keep the vessel afloat. Thirst returned with a vengeance. Their water supply, contained in a wooden cask, had been damaged during the loading. Salt water had seeped in. The water was brackish and undrinkable. Their tongues swelled until they could barely speak. They sucked on raw seal meat to extract moisture. They were dying of dehydration in the middle of an ocean. Vincent and McNish were failing. They lay in the bottom of the boat, too weak to move, their spirits broken by the relentless pounding. Shackleton and Crean gave them their own meager rations of milk, trying to keep the spark of life going. On the 14th day, May 8th, through a rift in the storm clouds, they saw a black shape. It was not a wave. It was a peak. It was South Georgia. A surge of adrenaline coursed through their wasted bodies. They were there. They had done the impossible. They had navigated 800 miles of the worst ocean on Earth in a 22-foot boat. But the sea had one final cruelty in store. A hurricane, one of the worst recorded in that region, descended upon them just as they neared the coast. They could hear the roar of the surf crashing against the unseen cliffs, a sound like continuous thunder. They were caught between the fury of the storm and the hard anvil of the island. For 9 hours they tacked back and forth in the darkness, fighting to stay offshore, fighting to keep from being smashed against the rocks they had traveled so far to reach. The wind ripped the water off the surface of the ocean, creating a white mist of spray. Finally, the storm broke. On the morning of May 10th, 1916, the James C. Caird limped into King Haakon Bay, a deserted inlet on the uninhabited west coast of South Georgia. They were on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations were on the east coast, but they didn't care. They found a small cove and steered the boat in. As the keel grated against the sand, Shackleton, Crean, and Worsley crawled out. They were unable to stand upright. Their legs were atrophied from 2 weeks of crouching. They fell upon a small stream of fresh glacial water running down the beach. They drank and drank, faces buried in the icy water, indifferent to everything else. They were on land. The boat journey was over, but the rescue was not yet complete. The sensation of solid earth beneath their feet was a shock to the system, almost as disorienting as the heaving ocean had been. The 6 men, wasted and skeletal, stumbled about the small beach at King Haakon Bay like drunkards. Their equilibrium, tuned for weeks to the violent pitching of the James Caird, could not adjust to the stillness of the land. But the water, the sweet, cold, glacial water that trickled down the rocks, was the immediate salvation. They knelt in the black volcanic sand, lapping at the stream with swollen tongues, their bodies soaking up the moisture like dry sponges. For the first time in weeks, the crushing anxiety of imminent death receded, replaced by a profound, exhaustion-fueled relief. They were alive. They had cheated the ocean. However, the sanctuary of King Haakon Bay was deceptive. While they were on land, they were still trapped in a frozen wilderness. The bay opened to the west, exposing them to the prevailing winds, and the beach they had landed on was little more than a rocky shelf beneath overhanging cliffs. They named it Cave Cove for a shallow recess in the rock face where they huddled for shelter, but it was a precarious home. Huge icicles, some weighing hundreds of pounds, hung from the cliffs above, threatening to detach and spear the men as they slept. The surge of the tide threatened to sweep their battered boat back into the sea. After a few days of recuperation, during which they feasted on albatross chicks found in nests on the cliffs, a rich, oily meat that revitalized their starving bodies, Shackleton decided they must move. They sailed the James Caird a few miles to the head of the bay, to a gently sloping beach of sand and pebbles. They turned the boat upside down on a patch of tussock grass, creating a makeshift hut they dubbed Peggotty Camp, a reference to the boathouse in Dickens' David Copperfield. Here, the final, brutal reality of their situation became clear. They were on South Georgia, yes, but they were on the wrong side. The whaling stations, Stromness, Husvik, Grytviken, were on the north and east coasts, protected from the westerly winds. Between Peggotty Camp and those stations lay the interior of the island, a chaotic jumble of jagged peaks, unmapped glaciers, and snowfields that had never been trodden by human feet.
No one had ever crossed South Georgia. The map of the island's interior was a blank white space. To sail around the island to the stations was impossible. The James Caird had lost its rudder in the landing, the hull was weakened, and the men were too depleted to face the ocean again. The only way out was up. Shackleton looked at his crew. Vincent was collapsing, unable to walk. McNish, the carpenter, was aged beyond his years, his spirit frayed. McCarthy was weak. Only 3 men possessed the physical reserves to attempt a crossing: Shackleton himself, Frank Worsley, and the indomitable Tom Crean. It was decided. The 3 strongest would climb the mountains and walk to Stromness to get help. The other 3 would remain under the overturned hull of the James Caird, waiting for rescue. The preparation for this alpine crossing was a study in improvisation. They were sailors, not mountaineers. They had no climbing ropes, no ice axes, no crampons, no tents, and no sleeping bags. Their clothing was the same rotting, threadbare wool they had worn for a year, stiff with blubber and soot. To create traction on the ice, McNish pulled brass screws from the planking of the James Caird and drove them through the soles of the men's boots. These makeshift crampons, 4 screws in each heel, 4 in each sole, would be the only thing keeping them from sliding into the abyss. They carried a carpenter's adze to chop steps in the ice, a length of frayed rope, a Primus stove, and enough food for 3 days, pemmican and biscuits carried in socks slung around their necks. For the night of May 19, 1916, the moon was full. The weather for a brief window seemed to settle. At 3 a.m., Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean crawled out from under the boat. They said their goodbyes to the 3 invalids left behind. It was a quiet parting. Both groups knew that if the climbers failed, everyone would die. The 3 men turned their backs on the sea and began to trudge up the snowy slopes, the moonlight casting long, eerie shadows across the white expanse. The climb was an ordeal of silence and snow. They ascended steadily, the screws in their boots biting into the hard-packed surface. The interior of South Georgia is a labyrinth of peaks and glaciers, a place where the geography seems designed to confuse and trap the traveler. They climbed a ridge, hoping to see a clear path to the other side, only to find a sheer drop-off or a chaotic ice fall blocking their way. They would have to retrace their steps, losing hard-won elevation, and try a different route. This happened again and again. They were navigating by instinct and Worsley's uncanny sense of direction, reading the landscape like a complex text. By late afternoon on the first day, they found themselves atop a razor-edged ridge. The light was failing. Below them, the slope fell away into a deep bowl of shadow. Fog was beginning to roll in, obscuring the bottom of the descent. They were in a desperate position. If they stayed on the ridge overnight, exposed to the wind and temperatures well below freezing, without a tent or sleeping bags, they would freeze to death. If they climbed down slowly, cutting steps with the adze, they would be caught in the darkness on the face of the cliff, a recipe for disaster. Shackleton stood at the edge, looking down into the gray void. He turned to the others and proposed the unthinkable. They would slide.
It was a suggestion of madness. To slide down a mountain into the mist, not knowing if there were rocks, crevasses, or a precipice at the bottom, was suicide. But the alternative was certain death by freezing. They sat on the snow, one behind the other, like children on a toboggan. They locked their arms around each other. Shackleton was in the front, Worsley in the middle, Crean at the back. Without a word, they pushed off. In seconds, they were hurtling down the mountain. The wind roared in their ears. The snow sprayed into their faces, blinding them. They accelerated, the world blurring into a streak of gray and white. They dropped hundreds, perhaps thousands of feet in a matter of minutes. The terror was absolute, a suspension of gravity and control. Then, gradually, the slope flattened. Their speed decreased. They came to a halt in a soft bank of snow at the bottom of the bowl. They stood up, shaking, covered in snow, and realized they were alive. They had descended in minutes what would have taken hours to climb down. They laughed, a manic, hysterical release of tension, shaking hands in the gloom. But the journey was far from over. They marched through the night, terrified to stop. Shackleton knew that if they sat down to rest, the seductive warmth of hypothermia would set in. They would fall asleep and never wake up. He instituted a strict rhythm: march for a specific time, then stop for a brief meal of hot hoosh cooked on the Primus stove, then move again. Whenever the other two men began to nod off during a break, Shackleton would wake them after only 5 minutes, telling them they had slept for half an hour. He was manipulating their perception of time to keep them moving. As they crossed the desolate, moonlit glaciers, a strange phenomenon occurred. Later, all 3 men would recount the feeling that there were not 3 of them, but 4. A silent companion seemed to walk with them, a presence that offered no words but provided a sense of guidance and comfort. This 4th man became a part of the legend of the crossing, a manifestation of their extreme psychological state, or, as they believed, a divine intervention. Dawn broke on May 20th. They were exhausted, their bodies running on fumes. The landscape was still rugged, but they recognized features that Worsley had seen on charts years before. They were nearing the whaling stations. At 7 a.m., a sound cut through the crisp morning air. It was a sound so alien to their environment, so mechanical and precise, that it stopped them in their tracks. It was the steam whistle of the whaling station at Stromness, blowing to wake the men for work. To Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean, it was the sweetest music they had ever heard. It was the sound of humanity. It meant that men were nearby, men with food, warmth, and ships. Energized by the sound, they pushed forward. But South Georgia had one final obstacle. They found themselves at the top of a 30-foot waterfall, the water crashing down into a pool below. The cliffs on either side were too steep to climb down. They were so close, yet physically blocked. There was no way around. They had to go through it. They secured their rope to a boulder. One by one, they lowered themselves into the freezing cascade. The water pounded them, soaking their clothes instantly, stealing the last dregs of their body heat. They dropped into the pool at the bottom, gasping, shivering violently, and waded to the bank. They were now on the outskirts of the whaling station. They walked along a stream, their boots squelching, their rags dripping. They looked like creatures from a nightmare. Their hair hung to their shoulders, matted and greasy. Their beards were tangled thickets encrusted with salt and blubber smoke. Their clothes were patchwork quilts of rot, stiff with blood and filth. They smelled of death and seal oil. As they approached the station, they saw the first people they had laid eyes on in 18 months outside of their own crew. 2 small children, sons of the station staff, were playing by the water. The children looked up, saw the monstrous figures approaching, and screamed. They turned and ran in terror. The men trudged on, ignoring their reaction. They reached the wharf. A Norwegian foreman looked at them, his eyes widening in disbelief. He didn't ask who they were. He simply pointed them toward the manager's house. The manager of the Stromness station was Thorolf Sorley.
He had known Shackleton from years before, a civilized acquaintance from a different lifetime. When the three men arrived at his door, Sorley looked at them. He saw three savages, barely standing, filling his hallway with a pungent, feral odor. He did not recognize them. There was a long, heavy silence. Finally, the manager asked, "Who the hell are you?" The man in the center, the one with the heavy jaw and the haunted but burning eyes, straightened his back. His voice was raspy, cracked from disuse and dehydration, but it held a quiet dignity. "My name is Shackleton," he said. The revelation was like a thunderclap. Everyone believed the Endurance had been lost with all hands long ago. To see Shackleton standing there, alive, having walked out of the frozen interior of the island, was like seeing a ghost return from the grave. Tears stood in Sorley's eyes. He ushered them inside. They were given hot baths, fresh clothes, and food. They ate cakes and drank coffee, the simple flavors overwhelming their senses. Worsley later recalled the sensation of clean cotton against his skin as one of the most luxurious feelings of his life. But for Shackleton, the bath and the food were merely fuel for the next task. He could not rest. 22 of his men were still stranded on Elephant Island, living under 2 overturned boats, unaware that help had arrived. 3 more were waiting under the James Caird in King Haakon Bay. His mission was not complete until every single man was safe.
Worsley was sent back on a whaler that very night to pick up the 3 men at King Haakon Bay. They were rescued the next day, bewildered but overjoyed to see their captain return so soon. But Elephant Island was the greater challenge. It was 800 miles away, surrounded by the pack ice that had already crushed their ship. Shackleton began a desperate campaign of rescue attempts. He chartered a whaling ship, the Southern Sky, and sailed south. But the pack ice was impenetrable. It formed a solid barrier 60 miles from the island. They were forced to turn back. He went to the Falkland Islands and borrowed a trawler from the Uruguayan government. Again, the ice blocked them. He went to Chile and chartered a schooner, the Emma. The engine broke down, and the ice beat them back again. It was now August. The men on Elephant Island had been stranded for 4 months since the boat journey began. Shackleton was frantic. He was aging visibly, his hair turning white, his heart straining under the stress. He felt the weight of those 22 lives every waking moment. Finally, on August 25, 1916, Shackleton secured a small Chilean steam tug named the Yelcho. It was not an icebreaker. It was a small, steel-hulled vessel, totally unsuited for the Antarctic. But it was his last hope. The captain of the Yelcho, Luis Pardo, was a brave man who agreed to take the risk. They sailed south, praying for a gap in the ice. On Elephant Island, the situation was dire. The men were starving. They had resorted to digging up old seal bones and boiling them for soup. The morale was crumbling. Every day, Frank Wild, the second in command, would roll up his sleeping bag and say, "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." It was a ritual of hope, maintained even as the horizon remained empty day after day. On August 30, the mist around Elephant Island cleared. The men were preparing their lunch of boiled limpet shells and seaweed. Suddenly, a cry went up, "Ship-o! Ship!" Men scrambled out of the hut, knocking over the stew pot in their haste. They ran to the beach, waving their arms, screaming hoarsely. There, steaming through the mist, was the Yelcho. She was small, but to them she looked like the grandest ocean liner ever built. Shackleton, peering through his binoculars from the bridge of the tug, counted the tiny figures on the beach. He counted them once, he counted them twice. He turned to Worsley, his face breaking into a smile that erased 2 years of agony. "They are all there, Skipper," he said.
They are all there. The Yelcho sent a boat ashore. Shackleton did not set foot on the beach. He stayed in the boat, shouting to Wild, "Are you all well?" "All well, boss," Wild shouted back, though they were clearly emaciated and frostbitten. The evacuation was frantic. They knew the ice could close in at any moment. Within an hour, all 22 men, along with their meager possessions, were aboard the Yelcho. As they steamed north, away from the hell of Elephant Island, the men gorged themselves on cigarettes and food, laughing, crying, touching each other to make sure it was real. They arrived in Punta Arenas, Chile, to a hero's welcome. The world, which had been consumed by the slaughter of the Great War, paused to marvel at this story of survival. In a time when millions were dying in the trenches of Europe for a few yards of mud, Shackleton had brought 27 men through the most hostile environment on Earth and had not lost a single life. The Endurance expedition was, by the strict definition of its goals, a failure. They never crossed the continent, they never even touched the mainland. But in their failure, they achieved something far more enduring. They set a standard for leadership and resilience that remains untouched. Shackleton's name became synonymous not with conquest, but with survival. As one of his contemporaries famously wrote, "For scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton." In the years that followed, the men drifted back into the world. Many of them, in a cruel twist of irony, enlisted in the war and were killed in action within months of returning to civilization. Shackleton himself could not settle. The call of the ice was too strong. In 1921, he organized another expedition, the Shackleton-Rott expedition, aboard the ship Quest. But his heart, strained by years of superhuman exertion, finally gave out. On January 5, 1922, while the ship was docked at South Georgia preparing to head south, Sir Ernest Shackleton suffered a massive heart attack and died in his cabin. He was 47 years old. At his wife's request, he was not brought back to England. He was buried on South Georgia in the Whalers Cemetery at Grytviken. He lies there still, his headstone facing south, toward the Antarctic he loved and fought, surrounded by the rough peaks and the wild ocean, forever resting in the white silence.
To fully understand the miracle of the survival, one must look away from the dramatic events on the ice and turn a forensic eye toward the vessel that carried them there. For the Endurance was not merely a passive victim of the Weddell Sea, but a masterpiece of specific nautical engineering. She was born in the Framnes shipyard in Sandefjord, Norway, a town where the air perpetually smelled of sawdust, tar, and the salt of the North Sea. Commissioned originally by Adrian de Gerlache and Lars Christensen for tourist cruises to the Arctic to hunt polar bears, she was initially christened the Polaris. The architects designed her with a singular purpose: to withstand the crushing lateral pressure of the polar pack ice. Most ships of the era were built with vertical sides, which, when squeezed by ice, acted like a wall against a battering ram, eventually buckling under the force. The Endurance, however, was designed with a cross-section that resembled a saucer or a bowl. Her hull was rounded and tucked in, a design choice intended to convert the horizontal pressure of the ice into vertical lift, squeezing the ship upward rather than crushing her inward. The materials chosen for her construction were the strongest available to the maritime world of 1912. The keel was a massive backbone of solid oak, the spine upon which the entire structure rested. From this keel rose frames of oak and Norwegian fir, spaced incredibly close together to provide maximum rigidity. Over these frames lay the skin of the ship,
a layering of planking that was almost obscene in its thickness. There was an inner lining of fir, followed by a layer of oak, and finally an outer sheathing of greenheart. Greenheart is a wood of exceptional density and hardness, sourced from the rainforests of Guyana. It is so heavy that it does not float in water, and it is resistant to rot and marine borers. This outer skin was intended to act as armor against the jagged edges of the ice floes. In total, the hull of the Endurance was nearly 30 inches thick in places, a wooden fortress that made standard merchant vessels look like paper boats. The bow, the point of first contact, was further reinforced with a massive web of internal cross-bracing and shod in heavy steel plates to allow her to act as a battering ram, smashing through ice up to 3 feet thick. She was a 3-masted barquentine, meaning her foremast was square-rigged, while her main and mizzen masts were fore and aft rigged. This configuration allowed for a balance between the power of the square sails when running before the wind and the maneuverability of the fore and aft sails when navigating tight channels. Her spars were made of pitch pine, flexible enough to bend in a gale without snapping, yet she was not purely a sailing vessel. Deep in her belly lay a coal-fired steam engine capable of generating 350 horsepower. It was a modest engine for a ship of her weight, 300 tons, giving her a top speed of perhaps 10 knots under steam alone. But speed was never the goal. Torque and reliability were the requirements. The engine was fed by bunkers that could hold enough coal to keep her steaming for weeks, though fuel conservation was a constant obsession for the engineers. The smoke from her funnel would become a dark smudge against the pristine white of the Antarctic, a signal of human industry in a desolate world. When Shackleton purchased her for the sum of £11,600, a fraction of her construction cost, he acquired one of the finest polar vessels ever built. However, a ship is only as good as the men who sail her, and the crew of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition was a collection of biographies as varied and rugged as the ship itself. The recruitment process had sifted through the adventurous, the desperate, and the highly skilled to find 28 men who could function as a single organism. Frank Wild, the second in command, was a man whose bloodline seemed destined for the sea. He claimed descent from Captain James Cook, the legendary explorer who first crossed the Antarctic Circle. Wild was a small, wiry man with a receding hairline and a quiet, unassuming manner that masked a constitution of iron. He was not a man of grand speeches or dramatic gestures. He was the quiet professional of the polar age. He had served with Shackleton on the Nimrod expedition and with Scott on the Discovery. He had spent more time in the Antarctic than almost any other living human. His role was that of the anchor, the steadying influence who translated Shackleton's broad visionary orders into practical reality. While Shackleton was the boss, the charismatic leader who kept morale high, Wild was the mother, the one who ensured the tents were pitched correctly, the rations were distributed fairly, and the minor disputes were settled before they became mutinies.
Then there was Frank Worsley, the captain of the Endurance, a man who seemed to have stepped out of a chaotic adventure novel. A New Zealander by birth, Worsley was 42 years old when he joined the expedition, though he possessed the energy of a man half his age. His joining of the expedition was a story he loved to tell. He claimed that one night in London he had a vivid dream in which he was navigating a ship through blocks of ice down Burlington Street. The next morning, compelled by the strangeness of the dream, he went to Burlington Street and saw the sign for the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. He walked in, met Shackleton, and was hired after a few minutes of conversation. Worsley was a man of contradictions. On land or in calm waters, he could be disorganized, eccentric, and prone to flights of fancy. But place him in a small boat in the middle of a hurricane, hand him a sextant, and he transformed into a genius of navigation. His ability to calculate their position on the heaving deck of the James Caird, with the sun obscured by storm clouds and the horizon a blurred line of spray, remains one of the greatest feats of navigation in maritime history. The third pillar of the expedition's leadership was Tom Crean. A towering Irishman from County Kerry, Crean was the archetype of the loyal polar traveler. He had run away from his family farm at the age of 15 to join the Royal Navy, lying about his age. He was a man of immense physical strength, with a chest like a barrel and a voice that could cut through a gale. Crean was not an officer, he was a warrant officer, a man of the lower deck who had risen through sheer competence. He had served with Scott on both the Discovery and the Terra Nova expeditions. On the latter, he had performed a heroic solo march of 35 miles across the Ross Ice Shelf to save the life of Lieutenant Evans, a feat for which he was awarded the Albert Medal. Crean was the morale officer of the lower deck, always ready with a song or a joke, but he was also the enforcer. When the Endurance was trapped and the social barriers began to break down, it was Crean's imposing physical presence that often maintained order. He was the master of the sled dogs, ruling the wolf-like pack with a mixture of affection and brutality that they respected. The scientific staff brought a different flavor to the ship. There was Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, a small, cheerful man who was arguably the most popular member of the crew. His value lay not just in his weather observations, but in his banjo. That instrument, a 5-stringed banjo made of zither banjo construction, became the heartbeat of the expedition. On the ice floes, in the dark winter months, Hussey would play comical songs, music hall hits, and Scottish ballads, while the men sang along. Shackleton recognized the banjo's value as a mental health tool, famously insisting it be saved from the sinking ship even when essential gear was being discarded. "It's vital mental medicine," he had said. Hussey was also a figure of light relief. He was often the butt of practical jokes, which he took with good humor. The medical team consisted of Dr. Alexander Macklin and Dr. James McElroy. Macklin was a heavy-set, bespectacled Scot who also took charge of the dogs and the sledging stores. He was methodical and deeply caring, eventually performing the delicate amputation of Blackborough's frostbitten toes on Elephant Island, using the last dregs of chloroform and light from a blubber stove. McElroy, on the other hand, was a man of the world, a handsome, somewhat cynical figure who had traveled extensively in the Far East and brought a touch of cosmopolitan sophistication to the ice. He suffered from malaria, a souvenir of his travels, which would occasionally flare up, leaving him shaking in his sleeping bag. And one cannot forget Frank Hurley, the Australian photographer. Hurley was a visionary artist and a technician of the highest caliber. He was known as the Prince by the crew, a nickname that alluded to his somewhat imperious manner and his absolute perfectionism. He carried with him heavy, fragile glass plate cameras, a cinematograph for moving pictures, and chemicals for developing film in the freezing cold. His dedication to getting the shot was legendary. He would climb to the tip of the main mast in a gale to film the bow breaking through the ice. He would stand on the ice in front of the advancing ship until the last possible second to capture the prow looming over the lens. When the ship was being crushed,
Hurley dived into the flooding hold, stripping off his clothes to swim in the freezing slush to rescue his sealed tins of glass negatives. Later, Shackleton forced him to smash hundreds of plates on the ice as they were too heavy to carry, a task Hurley performed with tears in his eyes, keeping only the best 120 images that would eventually define the visual legacy of the expedition. Beneath the human crew lived the dog crew. 69 dogs were brought on board, sourced from the Gimli area of Manitoba, Canada. They were a mix of breeds, huskies, malamutes, collies, and wolves, chosen for strength and fur density. They were not the uniform team of purebreds seen in modern racing. They were rough, aggressive working animals. They were divided into teams, each assigned to a specific crew member who was responsible for their feeding, training, and care. The bond between man and dog became intense. The dogs had names that reflected the whims of their drivers: Shakespeare, Samson, Hercules, Sailor, and less majestic names like Bummer and Snapper. They lived in kennels on the deck, which were eventually moved onto the ice to form Dogtown. The sound of their howling, the smell of their wet fur, and the daily drama of their hierarchy, the fights for dominance, the choosing of the king dog, provided a constant source of entertainment and distraction for the men. The dogs were fed on dog pemmican, a lower grade of the concentrated meat cake, and later on seal meat. Their tragic end, executed when the food ran out, remained a trauma that many of the men, particularly the soft-hearted Wild and the dog-loving Crean, carried for the rest of their lives.
Sustaining these men and dogs required a logistical operation of immense complexity. The provisions list for the Endurance reads like an inventory of a small floating grocery store, designed to last 2 years in a place where no resupply was possible. The cornerstone of their diet was pemmican. Pemmican is a concentrated mixture of fat and protein used by indigenous peoples of North America and adapted by polar explorers. The expedition's pemmican was manufactured by the Bothay Company of Copenhagen. It came in blocks wrapped in paper. There was man pemmican, which was higher in protein and sometimes mixed with dried fruit or crushed biscuit, and dog pemmican, which was coarser and higher in fat. In the field, pemmican was usually boiled with water and crushed biscuits to make hoosh, a thick, porridge-like stew that was the staple meal of the trek. It was calorie-dense, providing the 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day a man hauling a sledge in sub-zero temperatures required. Beyond pemmican, the hold was stocked with thousands of pounds of tinned meats, dried vegetables, and flour. There were specialized items intended to boost morale, cases of whiskey and brandy, which were strictly rationed and used for medicinal purposes or celebrations. Huge quantities of tobacco, as almost every man on board smoked pipes or cigarettes. The loss of tobacco on Elephant Island would cause more distress than the lack of food. And chocolate. The chocolate was supplied by Cadbury and Fry, heavy, dark blocks meant for energy. They also carried Triscuit biscuits, a baked whole wheat cracker that was durable and filling. The challenge of scurvy, the scourge of maritime history caused by vitamin C deficiency, was well known. While the specific vitamin had not yet been isolated in 1914, the preventative value of fresh meat was understood. Shackleton relied heavily on hunting fresh seal and penguin meat to supplement the tinned rations, a practice that undoubtedly saved their lives. The liver of the seal, in particular, was prized,
though they had to be careful with the liver of the leopard seal, which could be toxic in large amounts due to incredibly high vitamin A concentrations. The clothing they wore was a layered system, primitive by modern standards but effective. The base layers were wool, Jaeger wool underwear that was itchy but retained heat even when wet. Over this, they wore thick woolen trousers and sweaters. The outer layer was made of Burberry gabardine, a tightly woven wind-proof fabric that was breathable. Unlike fur, which could trap sweat and freeze, the gabardine allowed moisture to escape. However, for sleeping bags, they used reindeer fur. The fur was arranged with the hair facing inward, trapping a layer of warm air against the body. The skins were susceptible to rotting when they got wet, which happened constantly during the boat journey, turning the bags into slimy, heavy tubes that smelled of decay. On their feet, they wore finnesko, boots made of reindeer skin with the fur on the outside stuffed with sennegrass, a dried sedge grass from Norway that provided insulation and absorbed moisture. These boots were soft and warm, but lacked grip on ice, necessitating the use of the makeshift screws during the crossing of South Georgia. The expedition's scientific equipment was state-of-the-art for 1914. There were Lucas sounding machines for measuring the depth of the ocean, consisting of miles of piano wire wound on a drum. There were dredges for collecting biological samples from the sea floor. There were theodolites and sextants for navigation and surveying, anemometers for wind speed, and barometers for atmospheric pressure. The expedition's primary goal was not just the crossing, but a comprehensive scientific survey of the Weddell Sea sector. Even while the ship was trapped and drifting, the scientists maintained a routine. Hussey recorded the temperature and wind direction every 4 hours. Clark, the biologist, dredged the sea floor through cracks in the ice, discovering new species of plankton and jellyfish. James Wordie, the geologist, collected rock samples from the bellies of penguins, stones the birds had swallowed for ballast, as these were the only geological samples available to him in a world of ice and water. He theorized about the geology of the unseen continent based on these pebbles. The daily routine on the ship before the sinking was a structured attempt to maintain civilization. Breakfast was at 9 a.m., consisting of porridge, bacon, and tea. Lunch was at 1 p.m., usually soup and bread. Dinner was at 6 p.m., the main meal of the day, often seal meat or tinned stew. The night watchman would bake fresh bread during the night, filling the ship with a homely aroma that belied the freezing desolation outside. There were chores, scrubbing the decks, feeding the dogs, fetching ice to melt for water. The water gang would go out with picks and sledges to chop blocks from freshwater hummocks, old ice from which the salt had leached out over years. This ice was melted in a large tank connected to the galley stove.
The demise of the Endurance was not an instantaneous event, but a slow, mechanical failure of the structure. The pressure of the ice operates on a scale that is difficult to visualize. A flow of ice, miles wide and 10 feet thick, moving at a fraction of a mile per hour, possesses kinetic energy that is effectively infinite compared to the resistance of a wooden hull. When the Endurance was finally nipped, the sounds described by the crew were visceral. They spoke of the ship screaming and moaning. This was the sound of the tree nails, the wooden pegs holding the planks together, shearing off. It was the sound of the massive 12-inch beams snapping like matchsticks. The deck planks bowed upwards, opening seams that had been caulked with oakum and pitch. The iron plates on the floor of the engine room buckled. The ship was not just crushed, she was twisted, the torque applied by the ice moving in different directions at the bow and stern,
torqued the keel until it snapped, a spinal fracture that killed the vessel. When they abandoned ship, the transition from the Ritz, their warm, lit living quarters, to the ice was a shock of sensory deprivation. They went from a world of wood, brass, and the smell of tobacco to a world of monochromatic white and the smell of ozone and cold. The dump camp became a sorting ground for their material lives. Each man was allowed 2 pounds of personal gear. The rest was discarded. This selection process reveals much about the psychology of the men. Some kept diaries, others kept photographs. Hussey kept his banjo. Shackleton kept a page from the Bible and a handful of sovereigns, which he soon discarded to set an example. They left behind books, scientific specimens, and clothes. They slept on the ice in tents made of linen, which were translucent. In the summer, the 24-hour sun made the interior of the tents bright at all hours, making sleep difficult. In the winter, they were dark caves. The floor of the tent was a ground sheet spread directly over the snow. The body heat of the sleepers would melt the snow beneath them, creating a depression or a pool of water, so they often woke up wet. The medical challenges were constant. Apart from the major threats of frostbite and starvation, they suffered from polar anemia, a condition caused by the lack of sunlight and fresh vitamins, leading to lethargy and breathless fatigue. They suffered from constipation due to the lack of fiber in their all-meat diet, and then from dysentery when they ate fresh meat that was too rich. The saltwater boils mentioned earlier were caused by the constant friction of salt crystals grinding into the skin at the cuffs of their wrists and necks. The smoke from the blubber lamps caused blubber eye, a form of conjunctivitis that made the eyes stream and sting, blinding them temporarily. And yet, through all this, the daily logs show a remarkable lack of complaint. They recorded the wind speed, the temperature, the number of penguins caught, and the quality of the ice with a detached scientific dryness that masked the desperate struggle for existence. While the drama of the Endurance was unfolding in the frozen grip of the Weddell Sea, a parallel tragedy, equal in heroism but far darker in its details, was playing out on the exact opposite side of the Antarctic continent. This is the story of the Ross Sea Party, the forgotten men of the expedition. Their mission was less glamorous but scientifically vital. Shackleton's plan was to cross the continent from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea. To do this, he would need food supplies waiting for him on the second half of the journey. He could not carry enough provisions to travel the full 1,800 miles. Therefore, a second ship, the Aurora, was sent to the Ross Sea to drop off a team of men who would march inland and lay supply depots at specific latitude markers, 80 degrees, 81 degrees, 82 degrees, and finally at Mount Hope at 83 degrees south. These depots would be the life support system for Shackleton's crossing party. The tragedy lies in the irony. The Ross Sea Party did not know that Shackleton's ship had sunk. They did not know that Shackleton was drifting on an ice floe thousands of miles away. They believed he was coming, and that if they failed to lay the food depots, he would starve to death on the ice. Driven by this terrifying sense of duty, they walked into a nightmare. The vessel chosen for this task was the Aurora, a steam yacht built in 1876, much older and less capable than the Endurance. She was a veteran of the ice, having served with Douglas Mawson, but she was tired. Her captain was Aeneas Mackintosh, a merchant navy officer who had lost an eye during a previous expedition with Shackleton, but remained fiercely loyal. The crew was a mixture of scientific staff and sailors, including Ernest Joyce, a polar veteran who was arguably the most experienced traveler on the team, but possessed a personality that chafed against authority. There was also Ernest Wild, the younger brother of Frank Wild, Shackleton's second in command, and Arnold Spencer Smith, a clergyman and academic who served as the expedition's photographer and chaplain. The Aurora arrived in McMurdo Sound in January 1915. The plan was to winter the ship there, using it as a base while the men sledged inland to lay the depots. However, the Antarctic weather had other plans. On May 6, 1915, a ferocious blizzard descended upon the Sound. The Aurora was moored to the sea ice off Cape Evans, held by heavy steel hawsers and anchors. The wind speed exceeded 90 miles per hour. The ice began to break up. With a violent crack, the moorings snapped. The ship, with 18 men aboard, was blown out to sea, trapped in a massive field of ice. On the shore, 10 men watched in horror as the lights of their ship disappeared into the swirling snow. They were left stranded. The situation for the 10 men left at Cape Evans was catastrophic. Most of the fuel, food, and clothing intended for the shore party was still in the hold of the Aurora. The ship was gone, drifting north, unable to return against the pack ice. The 10 men were left with literally just the clothes on their backs. They had no soap, no tobacco, very little medical equipment, and only a fraction of the sledging rations needed for the depot journey. They were castaways in the most literal sense, inhabiting the very edge of the known world. Their survival depended on archaeology. They were living in the hut built by Captain Robert Falcon Scott during his Terra Nova expedition of 1911, the expedition that had ended in his death. The hut at Cape Evans was a large barn-like structure, insulated with seaweed and lined with tongue-and-groove boarding. It was dark, cold, and ghostly, filled with the detritus of the dead explorers. The Weddell Sea party began to scavenge. They dug through the snowdrifts around the hut to find refuse piles left by Scott's men 3 years earlier. They found tins of jam, rusty but intact. They found old biscuits. They found canvas that they could sew into wind-proof trousers. They made smoking pipes out of wood scraps and smoked a mixture of dried tea leaves, coffee grounds, and sawdust because the lack of tobacco was driving them mad. The psychological burden was heavier than the physical one. They had no radio communication. They had to assume that Shackleton was on his way. McIntosh, the leader, was adamant. The depots must be laid. Even though they lacked proper equipment, even though they were undernourished, they had to march hundreds of miles onto the Great Ice Barrier to plant food for a man who might never arrive. The Great Ice Barrier, now known as the Ross Ice Shelf, is a floating sheet of ice the size of France. It is a featureless white void where the horizon is often indistinguishable from the sky. To march across it is to walk through a sensory deprivation tank. In the spring of 1915, the depot-laying journey began. It was a feat of human endurance that rivals any other in history. The men were divided into teams, hauling sledges that weighed over 1,000 pounds. They had 4 dogs, but the dogs were not enough to pull the full load, so the men harnessed themselves to the sledges, acting as draft animals. This technique, known as man-hauling, is incredibly calorie-intensive. A man hauling a sledge in polar conditions burns approximately 6,000 to 7,000 calories a day. The rations they had scavenged provided perhaps 3,000. They were slowly starving to death while working harder than they ever had in their lives. The journey was a catalog of miseries. The weather on the Ross Ice Shelf was brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping to -40 degrees. At these temperatures, the friction of the sledge runners on the snow increases, making the snow feel like sand. Every step was a battle. But the insidious killer was not the cold, but scurvy. Unlike Shackleton's men in the Weddell Sea, who had access to fresh seal meat, which contains vitamin C, the Ross Sea party on the barrier was eating tinned rations and biscuits. Slowly, their bodies began to break down.
The symptoms of scurvy are terrifying. It begins with lethargy and depression. Then the joints swell and become painful. The gums become spongy and bleed, and teeth loosen. Old wounds, healed years ago, spontaneously open as the body loses the ability to produce collagen. The legs turn black and blue with subcutaneous bruising. By January 1916, as they pushed toward the 83-degree mark, the Reverend Spencer Smith was failing. He could barely walk. McIntosh, the leader, was also showing signs of the disease, his legs turning purple and swollen. Yet they pressed on. On January 26, 1916, they reached Mount Hope. They built the final depot. They planted the flag. They left the food and fuel that Shackleton would need for the final leg of his crossing. They had fulfilled their duty. They stood there, broken men in a broken landscape, looking south, hoping to see a speck on the horizon that would be Shackleton. There was nothing, just the wind and the white silence. The return journey was a death march. They were 400 miles from safety. Spencer Smith collapsed and could no longer walk. They put him on the sledge, increasing the weight the starving men had to pull. McIntosh was now so crippled he could only stagger a few hundred yards at a time. He eventually had to be strapped to the sledge as well. So now the remaining able-bodied men, Joyce, Richards, and Wild, were pulling a sledge carrying 2 dying men in addition to their gear. The weather turned against them. Blizzards pinned them down for days, consuming their precious food while they made zero progress. The hunger was absolute. They began to hallucinate. They talked to people who weren't there. On March 9th, Arnold Spencer Smith died. He passed away quietly in the tent, his body ravaged by scurvy. They buried him in the ice, a lonely mound in the middle of the barrier. He was 45 days from the hut. The survivors pressed on. McIntosh was delirious. They eventually reached the safety of Hut Point, an old discovery hut closer to the edge of the barrier, on March 18th. They had been on the ice for 169 days. They looked like monsters, skeletal, blackened by frostbite, their clothes hanging in rags. They found fresh seal meat at Hut Point. They ate it raw, the blood running down their chins, their bodies craving the nutrients. The fresh meat worked miracles. Slowly, the scurvy began to recede. Their gums healed. Their strength returned. But the tragedy had a final, cruel twist. They were at Hut Point, but the main base with the remaining supplies was at Cape Evans, 13 miles away across the sea ice. The sea ice was unstable, prone to blowing out in the frequent blizzards. Joyce, the experienced pragmatist, urged patience. He said they should wait for the ice to thicken. But McIntosh, perhaps driven by guilt over the loss of Spencer Smith or a desperate need to return to command, was impatient. On May 8, 1916, McIntosh and another crew member, Victor Hayward, decided to walk across the sea ice to Cape Evans. A blizzard blew up an hour after they left. They were never seen again. Their tracks ended at the edge of open water. They had walked off the edge of the ice into the freezing sea, or the ice had broken beneath them. They had survived the impossible march, only to die on a short walk home. The survivors of the Ross Sea party, Joyce, Richards, Wild, and Jack, remained at Cape Evans, waiting. They did not know if the Aurora had survived. They did not know if the world was still at war. They waited through another long, dark Antarctic winter. It was not until January 1917 that a ship appeared on the horizon.
It was the Aurora, repaired and refitted in New Zealand, and on board was Ernest Shackleton. He had come to rescue them. When Shackleton landed and heard the story that the depots had been laid, that Spencer Smith, McIntosh, and Hayward were dead, he was deeply moved. He realized that these men had sacrificed everything for a crossing he never even began. The depots at Mount Hope, laid with such agony and cost, are likely still there today, buried under decades of snow, a monument to a promise kept for a ghost. To truly appreciate the texture of this era of exploration, one must also look at the smaller, mundane details that occupied the 15,000 hours of darkness these men endured. The boring history lies in the inventory lists, the repair logs, and the culinary experiments. Take, for example, the matter of lighting. In the huts, they did not have endless supplies of kerosene. They improvised blubber lamps. These were made by taking a tin can, filling it with rendered seal fat, and using a piece of unraveled rope or a bandage as a wick. The light produced was dim, yellow, and smoky. It cast long, wavering shadows and produced a greasy soot that coated everything, the walls, the books, the insides of their lungs. Reading by blubber light was a strain on the eyes, yet reading was their primary escape. The library at Cape Evans contained books left by Scott and Shackleton's previous expeditions. They read the Encyclopedia Britannica from cover to cover. They read novels by Dickens and rapid-fire adventure stories. They read them until the pages fell out. Then they sewed the pages back in.
Clothing repair was another ceaseless activity. The housewife, pronounced hussif, was a small sewing kit every sailor carried. It contained needles, thread, buttons, and darning wool. On the ice, sewing was a torture. The needles were cold and difficult to hold with numb fingers. The thread would freeze and snap. To patch their trousers, they would use the canvas from provision bags. A man might walk around with sugar stamped on his backside or oatmeal on his knee. The reindeer skin boots, the finesco, required constant maintenance. The sen grass inside had to be taken out and dried every night. If it was left wet, it would freeze into a solid block of ice, making the boot impossible to put on in the morning. The men slept with their damp socks and boot liners inside their sleeping bags, against their chests, using their body heat to dry them out. This meant waking up in a damp, smelly fog every morning. The acoustic environment of the Antarctic is also worth noting. It is a land of extremes, total silence or deafening noise. On a calm day on the barrier, the silence is so profound that one can hear the blood pumping in one's ears. The crunch of snow under a boot can be heard for miles. But during a blizzard, the noise is physical. The wind screams. It has a voice, a high-pitched shriek caused by the air rushing over the granular surface of the snow. The tents flap with a sound like machine gun fire. Inside the hut, the stove roared. The Primus stove, a Swedish invention, burning vaporized paraffin, was the hearth of the expedition. The sound of the Primus being pumped and the roar of the burner was the sound of life. It meant tea. It meant hoosh. It meant warmth. The diet, while monotonous, was a subject of endless fascination and chemical calculation. The hoosh they ate was not just a stew, it was a calibrated fuel. The standard sledging ration consisted of pemmican, biscuits, butter, chocolate, sugar, and tea. The biscuits were Huntley and Palmer's, hard tack that was so dense it could break teeth. They had to be smashed with a geological hammer before being put into the stew. The butter was crucial. In the cold, the body craves fat. Men would eat lumps of butter like cheese. They would dream of fat.
Diaries from the expedition are filled with food dreams, long, detailed descriptions of pastries, suet puddings, and thick gravies. The lack of variety was psychologically eroding. The discovery of a forgotten tin of curry powder in Scott's hut was treated as a major event, a festival of flavor that broke the gray monotony of the palate. Medical treatment on the ice was primitive and brutal. There were no antibiotics. Infections were common and dangerous. A small scratch could become gangrenous. Frostbite was treated by slowly rewarming the affected area, often by placing a frozen foot against the warm stomach of a tent mate. This human heater method required a level of intimacy and shared suffering that bound the men together. Blisters were lanced with needles sterilized in the flame of a match. Toothaches were resolved with pliers and whiskey. The mental health of the men was managed through routine. Keeping a diary was mandatory. It forced the men to process their day, to externalize their thoughts. These diaries, written in pencil with freezing hands, often smudged with soot and grease, are the raw data of their survival. They list the wind direction, the miles covered, the dog's health, and the petty grievances of men living in close confinement. Joyce snores like a walrus, one might read. The tea was weak today, reads another. These banal observations were the anchors that kept them tethered to sanity. The wildlife they encountered was not just food, it was their only company. The Weddell seal is a placid, tube-shaped animal that shows no fear of humans, having evolved without land predators. This lack of fear made them easy to kill, a task the men hated but performed out of necessity. The emperor penguins were viewed with a mix of amusement and respect. These birds, standing 3 feet tall, would approach the men, bowing and squawking. The explorers often projected human characteristics onto them, calling them little old men or senators. The killer whales, or orcas, were the monsters of the deep. They would smash through the ice from below to knock seals or men into the water. Ponting, the photographer on Scott's expedition, was famously chased by a pod of orcas while standing on an ice floe. The whales coordinated their attack to rock the ice and break it apart. The atmospheric phenomena of the Antarctic added a layer of surrealism to their existence. The aurora australis, the southern lights, would paint the sky in curtains of green, pink, and violet. These lights would appear to move and shimmer, sometimes seeming to touch the ground. Then there were the parhelia, or sun dogs, optical illusions created by ice crystals in the air that created the image of 3 suns in the sky, or halos and crosses of light. To a starving, exhausted mind, these celestial displays could feel like spiritual signs or hallucinations. The water sky, a dark reflection on the clouds indicating open water, and the ice blink, a white glare indicating pack ice, were the navigational aids written in the sky. As we look back at the totality of the trans-Antarctic expedition, both the Weddell Sea party and the Ross Sea party, the sheer statistical improbability of their survival stands out. They operated with technology that today would be considered suicidal: wool, canvas, leather, and wood. They had no GPS, no Gore-Tex, no vitamin supplements, no radio. They navigated by the stars and the sun. They survived by understanding the physics of ice and the limits of the human body. The physiological adaptation they underwent is known as wintering. Their blood thickened, their basal metabolic rate slowed, and their psychological threshold for suffering shifted. What would kill a normal man in hours became a daily annoyance to them.
The end of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration is generally marked by the death of Shackleton in 1922. It was an era defined by a specific type of failure. Scott reached the pole but died returning. Shackleton failed to reach the pole and failed to cross the continent. Yet these failures are celebrated more than many successes because of the manner in which they were endured. The story of the Endurance and the Aurora is not a story of conquest. It is a story of the resilience of the human organism. It is a demonstration that the human mind, when stripped of all comfort and hope, can construct a fortress of will that is stronger than the ice. When the Aurora finally sailed back to New Zealand with the 7 survivors of the Weddell Sea party, they were greeted not with the fanfare that Shackleton received, but with a quiet respect. They were the men who had done the job. They had laid the depots. They had kept the promise. That the promise was moot, that the depots were never used, did not diminish the act. In the vast, indifferent ledger of the Antarctic, they had balanced the books with their lives. And so the ice reclaimed the continent. The huts at Cape Evans and Cape Royds were left to the wind. The snow drifted over the depots. The crushed ribs of the Endurance settled into the mud at the bottom of the Weddell Sea, 3,000 meters down, where they would remain unseen for 107 years until robotic cameras found them in 2022, perfectly preserved in the cold, dark water, the name Endurance still clearly visible on the stern, a brass star above it shining in the searchlight, a final testament to the ship that died so that her men could live. The return of the Endurance crew to civilization was not the triumphant fanfare one might expect from a classic adventure novel. Instead, it was a jarring, discordant re-entry into a world that had fundamentally changed. When they had left for the ice in 1914, the First World War was in its infancy, a conflict that many believed would be over by Christmas. When they returned in late 1916 and early 1917, the world was on fire. The concepts of chivalry and heroic struggle that defined the Antarctic explorers had been replaced by the industrial slaughter of the Somme and Verdun. The men who had survived the clean, white danger of the ice were immediately thrust into the muddy, gray danger of the trenches and the U-boat-infested Atlantic. The irony was palpable. They had spent 2 years fighting to keep 28 men alive against the odds, only to return to a civilization that was spending millions of lives for a few yards of dirt. Upon arriving in Punta Arenas and later South America, the crew disbanded with remarkable speed. There was no time for a victory lap. The war machine needed meat for the grinder. Almost every eligible man from the Endurance expedition enlisted immediately. It is a testament to their psychological resilience that after enduring 20 months of starvation and freezing conditions, their first instinct was to put on a uniform and head toward the sound of the guns. But this patriotism bore a bitter fruit. Within weeks of returning to the safety of civilization, several of the men who had been saved by Shackleton's obsessive care were dead. Timothy McCarthy, the young, strong Irish sailor who had sat in the James Caird during the boat journey, enduring the hurricane and the rogue wave, was one of the first to fall. He joined the Royal Naval Reserve. In March 1917, just months after his return, he was manning a gun on the oil tanker SS Narragansett. The ship was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland. It sank with all hands. McCarthy, who had survived the most dangerous boat journey in history, drowned in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, an anonymous casualty of war.
Alfred Cheetham, the cheerful boatswain who had been a veteran of 3 previous Antarctic expeditions and was known as the Pirate for his unkempt appearance, also joined the merchant navy. His ship, the SS Purnell, was torpedoed by a U-boat in the North Sea in 1918. He died just months before the armistice. The ice could not kill him, but a torpedo could. The officers fared differently, their war service marked by the same eccentricity and skill they had shown on the ice. Frank Worsley, the captain of the Endurance, became a legend in the Royal Navy for his unconventional tactics. He was given command of a Q ship, a heavily armed merchant vessel disguised as a defenseless tramp steamer, designed to lure U-boats to the surface. Once the submarine surfaced to attack with its deck gun, the Q ship would drop its false bulkheads, raise the white ensign, and unleash a barrage of artillery fire. Worsley, with his wild energy and navigational genius, was perfectly suited for this cat-and-mouse game. In one famous incident, he rammed a German submarine, the UB-85, sinking it. The German captain, upon being captured, reportedly complained that his submarine had been sunk by a madman. Worsley later joined Shackleton in northern Russia during the British intervention in the Russian Civil War, continuing his career as a soldier of fortune long after the ice had melted from his beard. Tom Crean, the giant Irishman, returned to the Navy and served throughout the war. But after the armistice, he did something that surprised everyone. He retired completely. He had spent 2 decades in the Navy and on the ice. He had been to the Antarctic 3 times. He had saved lives, marched hundreds of miles, and survived the impossible. In 1920, he returned to his home village of Anascall in County Kerry, Ireland. He married a local girl, Ellen Herlihy, and opened a pub. He named it the South Pole Inn. It stands there to this day, a pale blue building on the side of the road. But the most remarkable thing about Tom Crean's later life was his silence. He never spoke of his adventures. He never gave interviews. He put his medals in a box and kept them hidden. To the locals, he was just Tom, the quiet man who poured pints of Guinness. Perhaps he had seen too much. Perhaps the contrast between the majesty of the ice and the pettiness of the troubles in Ireland was too great. He lived a quiet life and died in 1938 from a burst appendix, a mundane end for a man made of iron. Frank Wild, Shackleton's loyal shadow, had a harder time. The Antarctic was his true home. Civilization was a foreign country. After the war, in which he served in Russia and monitored supplies, he drifted. He went to Africa, trying to make a living as a farmer in Nyasaland, modern-day Malawi, and later South Africa. But he was a man of the snow, not the sun. The farming ventures failed. He struggled with alcoholism and financial ruin. The man who had held 21 men together on Elephant Island, whose leadership had been the glue of the expedition, ended his days working as a barman in a hotel in Klerksdorf. He died in poverty in 1938. It was a tragic coda to a heroic life. However, decades later, in 2011, his ashes were recovered and transported to South Georgia. They were buried next to Shackleton's grave in the frozen earth they loved.
The scientists returned to their academic lives, but they were forever changed. James Wordie, the geologist, became a towering figure in British polar exploration, mentoring the next generation of climbers and explorers, including the men who would eventually conquer Everest. He became the master of St. John's College, Cambridge, but his mind never truly left the Weddell Sea. Leonard Hussey, the banjo-playing meteorologist, became a doctor. He served in the war, then practiced medicine in London. He kept his famous banjo for the rest of his life. He would occasionally play it for patients or at lectures, the tinny notes evoking memories of blubber lamps and penguin steaks. Upon his death, he He bequeathed the instrument to the National Maritime Museum, where it sits today, silent but heavy with history. And what of the stowaway, Perce Blackborough? The young man who had hidden in a locker to join the adventure returned home to Newport, Wales. His frost-bitten toes, amputated by the surgeons on the ice, healed, but he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He never went to sea again. He worked in the docks, lived a quiet life, and rarely spoke of the time he was the youngest member of the greatest survival story ever told. He died in 1949. But the central figure, the gravitational pole of this entire constellation of lives, was Ernest Shackleton himself. For Shackleton, the return to normal life was impossible. He was a man who only truly existed when he was struggling against disaster. The mundane routines of business, lectures, and domestic life suffocated him. He went on lecture tours, filling halls in America and Britain, recounting the story of the Endurance. He wrote a book, South, which became a classic of exploration literature. But he was restless. He drank too much. He smoked too much. His heart, which doctors suspected had been damaged by rheumatic fever in childhood and further strained by the superhuman exertions on the ice, was failing. He would feel pains in his chest, which he dismissed as indigestion. By 1920, the call of the South was irresistible. He organized one final expedition. It was vague in its objectives, searching for lost islands, mapping unknown coastlines, but the goal was irrelevant. The point was to go. He gathered his old guard. Frank Wild came, Worsley came, Macklin and McElroy, the doctors, came. Hussey came with his banjo. They bought a small Norwegian sealer named the Foka I and renamed her the Quest. It was a terrible ship, small, rolly, and plagued by engine trouble. But it was a ship, and it was heading south. The voyage of the Quest was a melancholy echo of the Endurance. The ship broke down constantly. Shackleton was unwell. He was bloated, breathless, and lethargic. He spent hours playing bridge in the wardroom, avoiding physical exertion. The fire that had burned so brightly on the ice of the Weddell Sea was flickering out. When they reached Rio de Janeiro, he suffered a suspected heart attack, but refused to see a doctor on shore, terrified they would stop him from continuing. The boss never gives up, he told himself, but his body was done. On January 4th, 1922, the Quest arrived at South Georgia. They anchored at Grytviken, the very place where the Endurance had departed 8 years earlier. The smell of the whaling station, the sight of the mountains, it was a homecoming. That night, Shackleton wrote in his diary, "The old smell of dead whale permeates everything. It is a strange and curious place. A wonderful evening. In the darkening twilight, I saw a lone star hover, gem-like, above the bay." At 2 a.m. on January 5th, Dr. Macklin was called to Shackleton's cabin. The boss was in pain. He was sitting up in his bunk, complaining of back pain and neuralgia. Macklin told him he needed to rest, to live a quieter life. Shackleton, with a flash of his old humor, looked at the doctor and asked, "You're always wanting me to give things up. What is it I should give up now?" "Chiefly alcohol, boss," Macklin replied. "I don't think it agrees with you." Minutes later, Shackleton suffered a massive coronary thrombosis. He died instantly. He was 47 years old. The man who had cheated death 1,000 times on the ice, who had navigated the Southern Ocean in a rowboat, who had brought every single one of his men home safely, died in his pajamas in a warm bunk, anchored in a calm harbor. The reaction of the crew was devastation. They were orphans. Frank Wild took command, but the heart had gone out of the Enterprise. They made a half-hearted attempt to go south, but the Quest was not up to it. They returned.
Shackleton's body was initially sent north to be returned to England, but in Montevideo, a message was received from his wife, Emily. She knew him better than anyone. He would not want to be buried in England, she said. Bury him there. Bury him in the South. So the body was returned to South Georgia. On March 5, 1922, he was buried at the Whalers Cemetery at Grytviken. It was a simple ceremony. The Norwegian whalers, men of the sea, stood in respect. His grave is marked by a granite headstone, and unlike all the other graves which face east, Shackleton's faces south, faces the magnetic pull that defined his life, faces the Antarctic.
With Shackleton's death, the heroic age of Antarctic exploration formally ended. The era of wooden ships, dog sleds, and amateur gentlemen walking into the unknown was over. The airplane age began. Machines would conquer the continent. Richard Byrd would fly over the pole. Massive tractors would traverse the glaciers. The mystery was replaced by mapping. The silence was broken by engines. But the story of the Endurance did not end in 1922. The ship itself, the actual wooden structure of the Endurance, was still out there. It was not a myth. It was a physical object resting on the abyssal plain of the Weddell Sea. For decades, it remained one of the most tantalizing lost ships in the world. Oceanographers and historians assumed it was gone forever, crushed to splinters by the ice before it sank. The violence of the ship's destruction, described so vividly in Worsley's and Shackleton's diaries, led many to believe that nothing recognizable would remain. Furthermore, the Weddell Sea retained its reputation as the evil sea. Even with modern icebreakers, the gyre of thick, multi-year ice made the region almost inaccessible. Several attempts to locate the wreck in the late 20th and early 21st centuries failed. The ice forced them back. The spirit of the Endurance seemed to be guarding her own grave. However, the biology and chemistry of the Antarctic deep sea suggested a different possibility. In most oceans, wood is devoured rapidly by Teredo nivalis, the naval shipworm. These mollusk-like creatures bore into submerged timber, turning solid beams into honeycomb in a matter of years. They are the reason the Titanic, which is steel, is being eaten by bacteria, but wooden ships in the Caribbean vanish. But the Weddell Sea is different. It is cold, brutally, eternally cold, and importantly, it lacks the specific wood-boring worms found in warmer waters. They cannot survive in the sub-zero temperatures of the Antarctic bottom water. This led to a theory. If the Endurance had not been completely pulverized by the ice before sinking, she might still be there, not as a pile of debris, but as a ship, a ghost ship, perfectly preserved in the freezing dark, waiting to be found. This theory set the stage for one of the most sophisticated underwater search missions ever attempted. In 2022, a century after Shackleton's death, the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust launched the Endurance 22 expedition. This was not a wooden barkentine relying on wind. This was the S.A. Agulhas II, a massive, red-hulled South African icebreaker equipped with the most advanced subsea technology on the planet. The goal was to penetrate the pack ice, reach the site where Worsley had calculated the ship went down in 1915, and use autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, to scour the seafloor. The challenges were the same as Shackleton faced, just managed with better technology. The ice of the Weddell Sea was still a trap. The Agulhas II had to use her immense power to ram through floes 10 feet thick.
The captains had to use satellite imagery to spot leads, just as Worsley had used the crow's nest. The tension on the modern ship was high. If the ice closed in, even a steel icebreaker could be beset. They had a limited window of time before the Antarctic winter slammed the door shut. The search area was defined by Frank Worsley's final sextant readings. The accuracy of these readings was a matter of debate. Worsley had taken them on a drifting ice floe with a handheld instrument under overcast skies using a theodolite and a sextant. Could a position calculated in 1915 really guide a robot in 2022? Or had the currents carried the sinking ship miles away? The search box was a patch of ocean floor measuring several hundred square kilometers. The AUVs, named Sabertooth, were untethered, battery-powered robots capable of diving to 4,000 meters. They were programmed to mow the lawn, scanning the mud back and forth with sonar, looking for hard anomalies in the soft sediment.
Day after day, the saber-tooths returned with nothing, just flat, empty mud. The crew of the Weddell Sea stared at screens, drinking coffee, waiting. The ghost of failure hovered over the mission. The ice was thickening. The season was turning. They had only a few days left before they would have to retreat. Then, on March 5, 2022, exactly 100 years to the day after Shackleton was buried, the sonar picked up a target. It was not a rock. It was geometric. It was large. It was roughly the shape of a ship. The team sent the Sabertooth down for a visual inspection. This time, the robot's high-definition 4K cameras and LED strobe lights were activated. The data traveled up through the acoustic modems to the control room on the surface. What appeared on the screens silenced the room. It was not a pile of wreckage. It was a stern. Rising out of the darkness, tall and proud, was the rudder, and above the rudder, perfectly legible in the glare of the lights, brass letters gleamed against the black wood. NDURANCE. And below that, Star. She was sitting upright, proud on the seabed. She was 3,008 meters down. 9,869 feet. The preservation was shocking. It looked as if she had sunk yesterday. The paint was still visible. The tree nails were intact. The wheel, the very wheel Shackleton and Worsley had stood behind, was there, still connected to the rudder mechanism. The portholes glinted. On the deck, the boots of the crew were lying where they had been kicked off. Crockery was scattered in the sediment. The camera glided over the deck. It passed the well deck where the dogs had lived. It passed the galley. It peered into the dark void of the skylight that led to the Ritz. The ship was not just a wreck, it was a time capsule. The cold water had protected her from biological decay. The depth had protected her from physical disturbance. She was pristine. The damage from the ice that had sunk her was visible, the crushed bow, the snapped masts lying on the deck, but the dignity of the vessel remained. The discovery was broadcast to the world, a rare moment of global wonder in a news cycle dominated by conflict. The images of the Endurance, ghostly and beautiful in the spotlight of the robot, went viral. It was a bridge across time. Looking at that wooden hull, one could almost hear the howling of the dogs, the strumming of Hussey's banjo, and the voice of Shackleton saying, "She's going, boys." The ship was not raised. She is a designated monument under the Antarctic Treaty System. She was left there, in the peace of the deep, undisturbed. The Weddell Sea turned north and sailed home,
leaving the Endurance to her eternal vigil. The story of the Endurance is, in the end, a story about the limits of human ambition and the limitlessness of human hope. It is a story that begins with a failure, the failure to cross a continent, and ends with a triumph of survival. It teaches us that the map is not the territory, that the plan is not the reality, and that when the world freezes around you, the only heat that matters is the heat of the person standing next to you. It is a boring history of ice, wood, and water, but within that boredom lies the essence of what it means to be alive. In the white silence of the South, under the Southern Cross, the Endurance waits, and the story, like the ship, endures.